Tonight's story is brought to you by FX. FX is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to helping charities with fundraising by providing them with the most innovative scarehouse and walkthrough events. They have created fully adaptive environments for the sensory sensitive so that everyone can enjoy the experience. For more information on FX and their services, please visit them on the web at www.phonefx.org. Without further ado, tonight's tale awaits you, right through there.
Welcome, my friends. Come, sit around the fire and let me spin another tale for your amusement. These tales, I tell you, these nightmares found only around the fireside, speak of many things, things which cannot be explained. Stories of the unknown, the unseen, and poorly understood. Some disturbing, yes, some terrifying, certainly. Stories of the darkness which reside in all of humanity, expressed in ways in which nature herself cannot account for, things beyond her ability and even beyond her comprehension, stories buried in time and hidden by shadow. Good evening. Tonight's tale is one of deep-seated hatred expressed through decades of time and of the unintended consequences of misdirecting that animosity. Join me, won't you, for The War Bride, a story told in two parts. Tonight's episode, Snow, is sure to leave you shivering. In a small family shrine, a candle is lit and a stick of incense is burning. Its smoke slowly and gracefully glides through the air up towards the heavens, dancing to some unknown, unheard sonorous melody. The sweet smell of its herbs gently filling the small bamboo and pine-paneled room where the shrine resides. The shoji screens have seen many such prayers over the several hundred years the Tamashiro family held the title to those lands. They had always been farmers, but in one of the many great battles of the late 16th century, one of their ancestors had done great honor to the family and to the ruling daimyo, and therefore was brought up from a simple farmer to the ranks of samurai. Since then, the family had taken great pains to honor that controversial decision and to honor their ancestors by by being as close to the samurai class as they could, with each generation learning and assimilating farther into that class and culture. Throughout the generations, many great deeds have had the Tamashiro name associated with them, and, though the family never grew beyond their rank, they remained quite content with their service to their lord and their place on their land. And even after the Meiji Restoration, which saw the overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate and the institution of a more gaijin government, the Tamashiro clan managed to keep their farm and their honor. It wasn't until World War II when the gaijin began their occupation of Japanese soil. After they dropped their atom bombs on the Ryukyu and on the mainland did the Tamashiro clan begin to feel like peasants again. With their official status of samurai gone, the Tamashiro had been reduced to nothing but farmers once more, and now they were nothing but farmers in a land conquered by the gaijin. For Mayumi-san, the most shame to be brought upon her family in the last 500 years is when her daughter, Yuki, fell under that gaijin's, that Shinigami's spell and lured her to the homeland of the enemy. Yuki was quite young when the gaijin tried to eradicate the Nihonjin with their atom bombs. But she grew up in the occupation. They tried to teach her well, as would have brought their ancestors both joy and honor, but Yuki was a stubborn child with a mind filled with the Western propaganda. Soon, she was sneaking out, hiding that hideous skirt with that dog and those sheer sock-like coverings on her legs under her traditional kimono. She thought Mayumi-san wouldn't notice. In truth, Mayumi-san felt helpless in the face of radical change. And then, that gaijin from the American military base found her. Yuki was entranced by him and his foreign ways, and soon her heart was his. Mayumi-san and her husband reluctantly attended the military wedding. That gaijin in his green uniform and those ribbons on his chest, and Yuki in what would be the last time she would ever wear the full attire of her ancestors, stood before the gaijin's altar and took their vows in the gaijin's tongue in front of that gaijin priest. For a while, Yuki lived with the gaijin on the military base, but then they were told they would be transferred, it was said at his request, to a military base back in America. Yuki was leaving in the morning, and Mayumi-san had prepared a special gift for her to remind her of the honor she carried and of the Tamashiro name she had so willingly thrown away. Before her, between her and the altar, laid an open brown paper package with the strings undone. Folded neatly on that paper was an underkimono of pure white silk brocade with the design of chrysanthemums woven into the silk. Under that was another folded kimono, this one of sky blue and white in a mountain motif. And under, a third kimono, a furosode of dark blue silk with white accents and orange lining, a white silk obi, and a pink obijime and white tabi completed the gift. Almost. A little trinket and a perfectly square piece of highly ornate paper sat in front of Mayumi-san as she made her prayers. To her side was a small, thin knife, a spool of thread, and a needle. As she prayed, she cut a few threads of the furosode's hem, opening a small pocket. Into this she placed the little trinket and repaired the hem. And now she prayed over the small square of brightly colored paper and precisely folded it into a crane. She then carefully attached the little paper crane to the back seam of the furosode at the base of the collar. She knew it wasn't strictly necessary. Custom dictated that the back seam in the garment would be enough to protect the wearer, and that such charms were usually reserved for small children, but Mayumi-san needed to remind Yuki-chan that she was still a child. She was her child, a child in the honorable line of Tamashiro, a child of Nippon. One final set of prayers as she meticulously folded the garments, wrapped them in brown paper, and a final stick of incense as she tied the otherwise unadorned paper-wrapped package with a finely braided and brightly colored silk cord. Mayumi-san was a woman of strong faith, but of stronger vitriol. She believed her prayers had been heard, but she could not know by what. Yuki's parents remained stoic, though she could tell her mother was seething behind her placid facade as they said their goodbyes. Bows were exchanged, wishes of safe travel, and Mayumi-san handed her daughter the special package she had prepared for Yuki. Yuki thanked her in the most formal and gracious way she knew. The young couple turned and left the family farm. They made their way to the airport and away from Japan. 1950s America was not what Yuki had envisioned. Life on a military base in America was similar to living on the base in Japan, but different than any other life she had ever known. For Yuki, a normally adventurous and carefree young woman, being off the military base was scary. She had only managed once, and after that harrowing experience, she refused to leave the base without her husband with her. She loved him, but she hated how it seemed the rest of America saw her. Off the base, she was just another foreigner, sometimes accused of being a spy for the enemy, sometimes taunted with atom bomb jokes of the most horrific nature. To those who were forced into camps like Manzanar or Tule Lake or Hart Mountain, and then freed to find they lost everything, she was a traitor and scorned for standing against her own people by being married to the government, which would treat her people in many ways the same as the Germans had treated the Jews and hundreds of thousands of others different than themselves. To the white Americans outside the military compound, she was a war bride, a term which Yuki understood to be the equivalent of concubine or prostitute. At least on the base there were others like her, others who had been there longer and taught her how to survive, how to cook American food, how to improve her English so that she could fit in better. They introduced her to hairstyles and magazines and TV shows and music. They taught her about her husband's religion and how to practice it without losing her own. They helped her to assimilate into the culture she had been thrust into by her hearts. Many would not even speak Japanese with her, but a couple of the newer war brides would still converse with her in that all but forbidden tongue. It had been a year since she left Japan, and in that year she saw that her husband had brought back demons with him from the war. They would haunt his dreams at night, or if he napped during his time off. They forced the most horrific sounds from him as he slept, cries for help, warnings to his comrades in arms, and sometimes just shouts of terror at some unseen ghost. He would wake without being fully awake, his heart racing and beads of sweat falling from his brow. But she would reach out to him, touch his arm, and after a few deep breaths, he would lay back down, roll onto his side facing her, and fall back into a troubled sleep. The demons never attacked him in the waking hours. Yuki had found the package that her mother had given her a year prior in the back of a small closet. It remained unopened. A strange sense of dissatisfaction fell over her, a subtle and quiet sadness, a nostalgic reminiscence of a time gone by, of times forgotten, and of places she would never see again washed over her. She reached gingerly for the brightly colored silk cord binding the package and untied the knot. A familiar smell of incense drifted through the room, deepening her sentimental reflections. She peeled the paper back to see those garments of silk her mother had, so long before, folded and bound together. They were of all beautiful shades of home, the colors of the ocean and the sky, the flowers on the hills and in the fields, and of sunsets long past. Tears fell, each in their own turn and none to be rushed, to blot the paper wrappings as she ran her fingers through the native cloth of her home. She held each item up as she unfolded them and laid them out onto the matrimonial bed, each in their proper place and order. Each garment was imbued with the smell of the shrine back home, of jasmine and herbs and charcoal and bamboo. She gazed at them before stripping off her new American wardrobe. She stood before them naked, silently asking for forgiveness for all that she had left behind, all that she had denied. Every tear which was shed was a prayer to relieve the dishonor she felt coursing through her, the disgrace her family must still be feeling even now. She dressed in those perfumed garments, slowly, carefully, and with the exacting adherence to the details required for one dressing in such an outfit. When she had finished, she stared at herself in the full-length mirror in their bedroom. Her makeup was wrong. Her hair was wrong. She was standing wrong. She was wrong and not worthy of wearing such clothing. She was no longer worthy of being a Honjin. She was the traitor they said she was, not to her adopted country, but to her family and to her ancestors and to their home. Her husband had found her crying and did what he could to comfort her, but it was to no avail. The dishonor she felt could not be assuaged by gentle words, professions of love, or acts of kindness. She had to feel this way. She had to feel the weight and the shame of her decisions. She had to feel it alone. Night fell, and Yuki could not escape her darkly morose airs. She refused her husband's touch, an unusual and almost traitorous act in itself for Yuki, and she refused him when he brought her food. She refused even to speak to him as he switched off the bedside table lamp and settled himself into bed for another restless night of disturbed sleep. She woke in the middle of the night. As her eyes opened and her vision cleared, she saw her husband standing in his nightclothes, staring at the mirror. She called to him, but he did not answer her. In the dark of the room, illuminated only by the light of the waning moon, he stood in front of the full-length mirror and gazed into the blackened abyss. She sat up in bed and swiveled to place her unshod feet onto the cold wood floor. She turned one more time to look at him as he swayed gently in front of the viscous night reflected in the mirror, and she said his name again, and again he did not respond. From the inky depths of the mirror, two clawed hands, bright as the moon and white as snow, shot forth and grabbed her husband by the shoulders. The hands yanked him in close to the mirror, and a face appeared in the glass, framed by long black hair which swayed in the unmoving air of the room. Its skin was grayish white, and its eyes glowed in the moonlight. its mouth opened to reveal many rows of small, sharp, and bright white teeth. And with a final pull, the creature disappeared back into the void, taking Yuki's husband into the mirror with it. Yuki screamed. She ran towards the mirror and saw nothing but her own reflection. She struck the mirror with the sides of her fist, screaming hysterically. And with the same suddenness, the creature returned. It was the same face, framed by the same hair, and it was dressed in full-length kimono, obi and obijime, of that same stark white, except the collar and the front of the creature's kimono were unevenly dyed in brownish crimson. The ends of the sode, too, were stained in that same brownish crimson color. Leon Ryu stared at her, and she stared at it. It raised a hand and traced out several lines of kanji, perfectly calligraphed and in bright, glowing crimson upon the glass. A bird outside gave a screeching cry, which sparked something in Yuki's memory, but in the horror of the moment, she could not place it. Yuki felt faint and sat upon the bed as she stared at the message left for her by the Onryo. The demon had faded, but the kanji stayed. A quiet tear rolled gently down her beautifully Japanese cheek, and her familiar stoic look overtook her features. She stood, stripped off her Western bedclothes, and dressed herself in just the white undergarments from the package her mother had given her a year ago. She walked into the kitchen, took a long paring knife from the drawer, and walked back into the bedroom. She knelt before the mirror, tied her thighs together just above the knees, with the bright silken cord originally used to bind her mother's final gift, prayed silently for forgiveness, and then plunged the knife into her own throat. Crimson spilled over the collar of her white kimono and down the front lapels. A white crane, with black markings about its neck and wings and a splash of red feathers on its crown, screeched at the window and pecked at the glass. It hopped frantically, and as Yuki's body slumped as the last of her life poured out onto the floor in front of around her, it dropped its head against its own breast and then flew off into the blackness. Jackson and several work friends went to Yuki's home in search of her husband, who had not shown for work that day. In the military, like in civilian life, not showing for your duty assignment without calling in was frowned upon, and in order to appease their supervisor, Jackson believed it would be better to check on them himself before the authorities got involved. They knocked on the door and received no answer. The door was closed, but not locked, and so they let themselves in. Calling for them both yielded no results, and so a cursory search of the house was started. It was a typical 50s-era home, clean and well-maintained, with the typical decor one would expect from the era, though less of it, as was the custom with military housing. It wasn't long before the bedroom was discovered, and within it the body of Yuki still kneeling in front of a plain, full-length mirror splattered with blood. Jackson rushed to Yuki and felt for the vital signs he was sure he would not find. Another left the room to breathe, and then to call the base police. The third, though, found his eyes drawn not to the terrible sight in front of him, but to a beautiful Japanese-style dressing gown of dark blue and white flower motif, and just a hint of orange at the sleeve openings and the hemline. The color seemed to flow across the silk, undulating to some unknown tide or gentle summer breeze. Jackson, believing his companion was overtaken by the hideousness of the scene, stood slowly while looking at him, and then clasped him on the shoulder. He offered to his companion to step outside of the room to get some air and to help the others in their party in getting the base authorities to the right address. The private first class insisted he was all right, and that he wanted to stay to watch over Yuki until the authorities had arrived. Jackson assented and left the room. As soon as Jackson had left the room, the PFC was free to achieve the object of his desire. Looking around hastily and finding a messenger bag used in their office for transporting large files and expansive reports, he carefully stepped past Yuki's body, folded the dressing gown neatly and thinly as possible, and placed it into the messenger bag. Quickly and carefully, he found himself back in his original position, and, when the authorities arrived, they thanked him for his vigilance and sent him home. No attention was paid to the messenger bag the PFC now carried. He went home and wisely thought to himself that placing the dressing gown at the bottom of his own bureau until this incident had passed long into memory would be the best and most prudent course of action. So he did, and then he forgot its existence. Several years had passed through the veil of history, and the wife of the larcenist PFC, now corporal, was packing up their room. The family had received their orders and were being transferred to another base across the country. She was glad that they were staying in the mainland U.S. It was late afternoon, and her husband would be returning home from work shortly. For the life of her, she couldn't understand why they had to have him at his post all the way up to the last day on this base. She was hardly paying attention to the clothing she carelessly threw onto the bed to be packed away in suitcases for the move in a few days. But when her hand brushed against an unfamiliar fabric, she looked down. She saw the most beautiful blue silk Japanese robe that she had ever encountered folded under his day clothes. She pulled it from the bottom of the bureau and held it up. "Oh my," she thought to herself, "this is wonderful." And then a different thought entered her mind, dark and untrusting. It was beautiful indeed, but why was he hiding it from her? Pangs of jealousy stabbed through her very soul, and then the front door opened. He was home, and she would not have anything other than the truth from him. He walked into the bedroom and saw her standing with the dressing gown he had pilfered from the dead woman's room all those years ago. His wife turned to look at him, her mouth taut, and her eyes filled with accusations. "I was hoping you wouldn't find that," he said to her. "Not yet, anyways." Her expression softened. Life in the military is difficult with a constant moving from base to base, and this move was to a different coast. He continued his explanation to her. That was a gift he was going to give her as a housewarming present when they arrived at their new base. "I suppose I should have done a better job of hiding it," he said, ending his extemporaneous equivocations. This seemed to appease her. The vitriol left her eyes. Her puckered lips unclenched and spread into a sweet smile, half of joy and half of apology. She kissed him and thanked him for the beautiful gift. She hung the dressing gown up in an almost empty closet, hoping some of the creases and wrinkles would disappear before she folded it and packed it away properly. She noticed the small, ornate paper crane attached to the back was wrinkled and yet still secure. She tried her best to smooth out the wings and the head and the neck of the small bird crafted from that beautiful paper. For 2 days it hung in the closet, and for those 2 days he had horrific dreams, while she slept comfortably, blissfully unaware. Their trip was filled with uneventful, casual days and terrible nights. His dreams slowly escalated in hellish torment, and she attributed it to nerves due to a new assignment and location. Their third and final day of travel before arriving at the military base was long and agonizingly slow. It was a warm day, the sun beating through the windshield and burning their skin. The 2 days on the road before, they had hardly noticed the sun. It was, in fact, quite pleasant, and they stopped several times to stretch their legs and once to picnic at a truck stop along the way. Until that third day, the sun had been warm and a comforting friend to them, but now it was almost unbearable. Even with all 4 windows rolled down, the heat in the car was oppressive, and it forced them to stop many times along the way, desperately looking for shade and a cold drink. Finally, they arrived at their motel. They were still several hundred miles away from the base, but the darkness and the air conditioning of the cheap motel room was a welcomed respite from the road and that merciless sun. They both took showers, had a bite to eat at the greasy spoon attached to the motel, and then retired for the evening. She awoke abruptly. At what time, she wasn't sure, but she knew it must have been early. She reached over for her husband and found that he was not in bed with her. She sat up and looked around the darkened motel room. At first, she couldn't see him. As her eyes grew accustomed to the dark, she saw his silhouette standing at the opening of the short hall facing the inside of the door to their motel room. He stood facing the door and swaying slightly. She called to him softly, and he didn't respond. 2 white, skeletal hands with long, thin, bony fingers and talon-like fingernails reached for her husband from the dark. She caught a glimpse of a long, white and stained sleeve hanging from those arms like sheets on a clothesline. The hands grabbed her husband by the shoulders, and the nails sinking deeply into his flesh. With a jerk, they drew him in close to the darkness, and a face appeared, framed in long, straight black hair. It was a face, pale and beyond age, devoid of life and light except for the eyes. Those eyes slanted like those Japanese soldiers from the war, like those war brides those other soldiers brought home instead of picking a white woman like themselves. Those eyes luminesced with a moonlight not currently seen outside their motel room window. The terror welled within her, threatening to burst through her chest as she trembled uncontrollably at the ghastliness of the scene before her. She fought to stay quiet, thinking that if the monster saw her, it would get her too. Finally, though, she couldn't hold it in any longer and she screamed. The horrifying thing, turned its head to look at her. It was emotionless as it stared at her with those unsettling, slanted eyes. And with a sudden pull, her husband vanished with the thing into the darkness. She screamed again and cried uncontrollably, staring at the space her husband once occupied. She recoiled from the scene, her body curled up and pressed against the headboard of the bed, away from the front door. An eternity passed, but in truth, it was only a moment before a single, bony, clawed hand slid around the corner of the hallway, followed by the thing itself. She stared in terror at it as it rounded the corner. It was not tall, and it looked female, with that long black hair. It looked like one of those Japanese girls, not the ones from the movies, those geisha girls in the big wigs and white makeup, but one that looked like it was in one of those block prints she had seen at a museum of Japanese girls stepping out of a half-barrel bath. Its hair was long and straight and black and looked like it was wet and hadn't been brushed. It hung down over its shoulders and down its back in a cascade of midnight black. It wore one of those robes like the one her husband gave her, but with shorter sleeves and a piece of cloth to tie it closed in the front. But it was white and not blue, and discolored at the sleeves and down its front. Strangely, and as terrifying as the sight was to her, she noticed her breathing became normal. Fear left her as she gazed into the silvered moonlit orbs underneath those slanted eyelids. Her body unclenched itself as the thing came closer to her. The curtains covering the motel room parted abruptly. Both the creature and the woman turned towards the sudden movement. Outside the window, hopping frantically and pecking at the fogged and condensation-laden glass, was a tall black and white crane with bright red plumage upon its head. The area of the glass where its long, poignard-like beak struck had begun to chip, and small fissures formed through the glass with each successive strike. The creature recoiled and withdrew into the darkness of the room. The woman fell on the bed unconscious. That may be where the story of the Pherosote began, but it is not where our story begins. Our story begins 70 years later. Thank you, my friends, for joining us this evening for this episode of Fireside Nightmares.
Tonight's episode of Fireside Nightmares was sponsored in part by Everbright Solutions. When you need your lighting display done by professionals and done right, Everbright Solutions is there for you. Find them on Instagram at Everbright_Solutions_LLC, and also by Redicus. Redicus is a leading cross-border e-commerce enterprise with a diverse product lineup including service calling systems, guest pager systems, tour guide systems, window intercom systems, conference devices, FM transmitters, and radios. Find them online at www.retekess.com. Be sure and listen in next week for our installment of Fireside Nightmares. These original short stories, based on folklore, urban legends, and the odd, demented flight of fancy, are sure to entertain and terrify. Good night.